let's focus in on the question of Yeshua and the law. Did he abolish the law? Now, some Christians would say, yeah, he did. He made an end to the law, and that's no problem because now we have Christianity. Well, it's a big problem if you're a Jewish person, because one way that you could distinguish a false prophet from a true prophet, or by extension, a false Messiah from a true Messiah, was their relationship to Torah. In other words, if someone comes along according to Deuteronomy 13 and says, okay, let's follow other gods, trash this, break all the commandments, follow other gods, trash this, and work signs, wonders, and miracles, you're just being tested. Reject them. That's why Yeshua says in Matthew 5, beginning verse 17, don't think I came to abolish the law of the prophets, but to fulfill. And then he goes on to say that until heaven and earth pass away, not one tiny little stroke of the law will pass until everything is fulfilled. And then he goes on to say, whoever keeps the least of these commandments will be great in the kingdom. Whoever breaks them, teaches others to do the same, will be the least. And your righteousness will surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees, Matthew 5, 17 to 20. Let me explain how Yeshua relates to Torah. First, if you will go through all of the commandments, and I do this, I do it for you, do the work for you in volume 4 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, but go through all the commandments that are forever, for all generations, and so on. If you will go through those, you will see that about 75% of the forever commandments have to do with commandments that we could only keep with a temple standing, functioning priesthood, and Jewish sovereignty in the land. In other words, through most of Israelite history and through most of Jewish history, we have been unable to keep 75% of the forever commandments. In fact, from within one generation after Yeshua until today, we have been unable to keep 75% of the forever commandments. If you will actually go through the Torah starting in Exodus 12, which is the very beginning of chapters dealing with giving of law, with Passover, and then in particular, Exodus 20 and thereafter, and look at all of the legal chapters, all the chapters dealing with commandments, laws, etc., you'll find there roughly 75%. The vast, vast majority of the content there cannot be observed without a functioning priesthood, standing temple, and Jewish sovereignty in the land. Now, Yeshua prophesied that this was going to be destroyed, the temple was going to be destroyed, and we'd be exiled and suffer terribly. And he prophesied and said that his death was the beginning of the new covenant. He was inaugurating the new covenant with his body and with his blood. And that this was now going to bring a new and better covenant that Jeremiah prophesied in Jeremiah 31 with the Torah of God being put in our hearts. Does it mean the same Torah? This means the teaching of the Lord. Could be the same 5 books, could be other things, but the principles, the teaching of the Lord would now be put in our hearts, and we'd be supernaturally empowered to keep these things. And there'd be a once-for-all forgiveness of sins instead of annual sacrifices, annual sacrifices, annual sacrifices. So what does he tell us? To summarize for you, he takes everything having to do with approach to God, namely sacrifice, offering, temple, priesthood, blood, and he himself becomes our great high priest. He himself becomes the ultimate sacrifice, the atoning power, the death of the righteous. And in himself, all these things we can't fulfill anymore, he now does and brings to completion. He brings to completion what the animal sacrifices were pointing to, what the priestly ministry was pointing to. He brings it to completion. Now, let me take this a little further. He takes the moral commandments of the Torah and takes them to a deeper ethic. You've heard, don't commit adultery. I'm telling you, don't commit adultery even in your heart. He takes them to a higher level, and then he illustrates how we are to live in this new covenant life, how we are to live now empowered by the Spirit. Now, here's something very interesting. Matthew 5:17, he says, I didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets. It's unusual to have those two phrases together in the New Testament. In fact, elsewhere in Matthew, it only occurs a couple of times. He says, I didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets. And then in Matthew 7:12, he makes reference to this sums up the law and the prophets. Do to others as you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. What's the point? Let me explain. From what we can see of ancient Jewish sermons, there was a certain structure. You had an introduction or a prologue. Then you had the heart of the sermon. Then you had the concluding exhortations. I see the exact same thing in the Sermon on the Mount, as do other scholars. Matthew 5, 3 through 16 is the prologue, the introduction. Blessed, truly happy are the poor in spirit, are the meek, and so on. This is the introduction. You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Now, the heart of the sermon. Matthew 5:17 to 7:12. Begins with law of the prophets, ends with law and the prophets. All right, so this is the parenthesis on either side, if you want, saying this is the body of it, right here in the middle. This is the body of it. This is my main sermon. What's he saying? This is how you live it out. Whoever obeys the least of these commandments, whoever breaks the least of these commandments. Which commandments? The commandments he's now going to give, which articulate kingdom living, which articulate how to live in the newness of the Spirit. So ultimately, when there is no temple standing, where there are no blood sacrifices, when none of these things can be kept anymore, we can live them out. Do you see it? So 5:17 to 7:12, that's the body of the Sermon on the Mount. That's why he sums up in verse 12 of Matthew 7 saying, therefore, do to others as you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. Why is there a therefore? The previous verses 7 through 11 don't seem to lead into that. Ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened. For everyone who asks receives, he who seeks finds, to him who knocks the door is open. What man is there of you, if his son asks for bread, we'll give him a stone. If he asks for fish, we'll give him a snake instead. If you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your heavenly Father give good things to those who ask him? And then, therefore, where's the therefore come from? He's now summing up. Okay, I've taught this. I've laid this out. This is kingdom life. This is the messianic way. This is the higher life I'm calling you to. This is life in the Spirit. This is life empowered by humbling yourselves and being blessed and strengthened by God. And then he goes on from verse 13 to the end of the chapter with his closing exhortation. Beware of false prophets. Strive to enter into the straight gate. Build your house on the rock of obedience to my words. You see, he's saying this is how you live it out. So he knew that the vast majority of the laws we wouldn't be able to keep. He knew that there would be this disruption. And rather than leave us without a temple and without a sacrifice, without a priesthood, he brought that to fulfillment in his own life. He fulfills the biblical calendar, as we saw in previous classes, his death corresponding to Passover, his resurrection, first fruits, the giving of the Spirit, Shavuot, Pentecost, and then what we still await, his return with the blast of the shofar, Yom Teruah, which becomes Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish calendar, and then Yom Kippur, national cleansing for Israel after he returns, and then all the nations coming into Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot, tabernacles. He's the fulfillment of the biblical calendar, that which has been and that which is yet to be. And then there's more. There's more. Sabbath. There are many, many Messianic Jews I know, and they observe the Sabbath. They love the Sabbath. As I record this now on a Friday afternoon, I spoke with a Messianic Jewish leader a few hours ago, and he wished me Shabbat Shalom. That's lifestyle for him. He wasn't doing that because he's trying to win a Jew to Jesus. He's going to put on the show and make believe he's Jewish. No, he loves the Sabbath, and God gave it, and Yeshua never rescinded it. But I want to show you that it goes beyond that. I want to show you it goes beyond that. Matthew chapter 11, beginning verse 28, Yeshua says, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Learn of me. Take my yoke upon you. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Find out who I am. Emulate me. You'll find rest for your souls. Rest, the operative word there. Now that goes straight into Matthew 12. And in Matthew 12, there are disputes about Sabbath observance. And Yeshua is pointing to a better way and saying you're caught up with minutia. You're caught up with a certain system. There is more to it. I'm showing you a better way. And ultimately, I am the Sabbath rest you're looking for. You find it in me. The Messiah embodies it. Now, it doesn't mean that we become lawless. What it means is we now see what the Scriptures were pointing to, what God's intent was. So yes, you can observe a seventh-day Sabbath, but it's no death penalty for not observing it, because the goal is ultimately to find rest in Messiah. And those that have it on their hearts to observe the seventh-day Sabbath, they do. They don't divide over it from other brothers and sisters. If they're church friends that celebrate the resurrection of Messiah on Sunday and meet then, we don't divide over these things because our ultimate rest is found in him. So Yeshua does not abolish the Torah. He gives us the messianic way to live it out in newness of life in the Spirit. Again, we could get into more depth in that. I'm sure you have other classes, New Testament classes, theology classes that will get into more depth in that. And I get into more depth in my book. What about Paul abolishing the law? There are many passages, or a good number of passages in his teachings, that seem to speak of the end of the Torah. Romans 10:4, Christ is the end of the Torah for all who believe. Or Ephesians 2, that he has abolished the commandments. Or Romans 6, we're not under law, we're under grace. Is Paul advocating the abolition of Torah? Certainly not. Certainly not. Number one, we see in the book of Acts, as I mentioned in the last lecture, we see in the book of Acts that he himself continued to live as a Torah-observant Jew. In the life of the Spirit, not bound by human tradition, in the life of the Spirit. He articulates that in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, that his ultimate law was the law of the Messiah and God that he followed. But he continues to live as a Jew. He preaches in the synagogues. How do you get in the synagogue if you're obviously not a Jew and known to be not a Jew or not living as a Jew? How do you get in the synagogues and have a dialogue with the Jewish leaders? Because he was living as a Jew. And he appeals to that even at a trial. Even in Acts, the 23rd chapter, he says, I'm a Pharisee. Yeah, it's still the group that I identify with in terms of Jewish groups, even though I'm a follower of Yeshua and a follower of the way, as it was called. So there are passages that could sound easily as if he's saying this is the abolition of the law. Of course, it would put him in conflict with Jesus, which raises the question, how come there were Jewish followers of Yeshua that recognized Paul? For example, the Nazarenes, as they were called, they followed the teachings of Yeshua, recognized him as the divine Messiah, rejected the rabbinic traditions that were developing, and believed that Paul was a true apostle. So obviously, people did not always find contradiction here. And the book of Acts tells us there is no contradiction because Paul himself lives as a Jew. Here's what we need to understand when we read the writings of Paul. And the New Testament tells us itself in 2 Peter 3 that some of his writings are hard to understand and people have misinterpreted them. If it's hard to understand, it can't be from the Lord. Do you really believe that if you're a religious Jew? You've ever learned Talmud? Of course not. Sometimes the difficulty of it is the reward itself, that you have to dig deeper and pray more and think more and compare more what's being said. Number one, we need to understand that Paul was primarily writing to Gentiles. So, for example, when he wrote to the Galatians, these were Gentiles living in Galatia. There were other followers of Jesus who came and taught. They were Jewish followers of Yeshua, but they had departed from the real gospel message, and they were telling Gentiles, you must be circumcised and obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. You must be circumcised and obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. And Paul said, no, if you do that, then you've fallen from grace. You're no longer just receiving God's mercy and grace and favor. No, you're now saying you've got to keep every... No, that's not why the Messiah came. The Messiah did not come to make Gentiles into Jews. He came to make a way for Jew and Gentile to be forgiven of sin and come into new life in him. So Paul is combating that. And when he is combating things in the midst of that letter, he's not telling Jews don't live as Jews. That was never the dispute. Jews lived as Jews. In fact, he writes in 1 Corinthians 7, if you came to faith in Messiah, you were circumcised, don't become uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised, don't become circumcised. If you come to faith as a Jew, don't become a Gentile. You come to faith as a Gentile, don't become a Jew. So, first thing we've got to recognize is that he was writing to Gentile believers, and he was not instructing Jewish believers about what to do and what not to do. That's the first thing. The second thing, he understood the law in a sense to be like scaffolding for a building. Scaffolding for building. That scaffolding is necessary when the building is being erected, but once it's built and it's standing on its own, you take the scaffolding down. He understood that the purpose of Torah was to bring us to the Messiah. Hence, Romans 10:4 uses the Greek word telos. Most English translations will say Christ, Messiah, is the end of the law, but it could just as readily be translated the goal to which the Torah prophesies, or the Torah points, the goal to which it's going is Yeshua the Messiah. So, when he speaks in this way, Galatians, the 3rd chapter, he explains that the law, the Torah, was a pedagogue, a tutor, to bring us to the Messiah. Let me explain. In the ancient world in which Paul lived, the ancient Greek world, he was a Jew who was a Greek citizen. You would have a household servant or slave, and the job of that slave would be to take children back and forth to school and oversee their mentoring and their education. In other words, not the teacher, but the pedagogue, the one that would be responsible for making sure they're getting trained and taught and cared for back and forth and so on, watched over. Well, Paul says that's what the law did for Israel. I use the analogy of scaffolding to say this was to keep Israel understanding who God is, what his laws are, what his requirements are, what his holiness is about, who the Messiah will be, to keep them on this path. Now that Messiah comes, now the building is completed, we don't need the scaffolding, we don't need the pedagogue anymore. Now the fullness has come, that which the Torah was pointing towards, and now God writes his righteous principles on our hearts. And for Gentiles, that's all that was ever required. God never required Gentiles to keep all of the law of Moses. When he says we're not under law, we're under grace, what he means is we're no longer under a system that we cannot live up to on our own. We're no longer under the law's condemnation. We're no longer under the law as a tutor or pedagogue. And we're no longer under the law as a system of righteousness and justification, because we see from the history of Israel in the Hebrew Scriptures that we fell short over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then from our near 2,000-year exile from the land that we've been falling short over and over again. Otherwise, we would have been fully restored and the glory of God covering the earth a long time ago. He recognizes that based on the system of law, it brings condemnation and judgment. That, as he says in Romans 7:12, that the law, the commandment are holy and just and good, but they show us our sin. So he writes in Romans 3 that no one's going to be justified by the law. Yeah, here it is, do it, live it out, and yet we all fall short, which then condemns us. You say, doesn't that abolish the law? No, he said it establishes it. Romans 3, because it's the law itself that tells us in Genesis 15 in the Torah that we're justified by faith. And that we need, according to Deuteronomy, a new heart. Where does that new heart come from? We can't get it on our own. We need God to grant it. That's what happens when the Messiah comes and we receive a new heart and a new spirit. Paul was also against anything that put a wall up between believers or anything that smacked of racial or ethnic or spiritual pride. So think of this for a moment. And by the way, the subject of Paul and the law is complex. I've meditated on it, studied it for decades, as many others have. I am not a scholar of Paul. I am a student of Paul for decades and involved in the scholarly literature. But there is a massive debate from every angle within the church, within the Jewish community, within the Messianic Jewish community. I'm simply laying out principles as best as I understand it and as simply as I can put these things. But let's understand that in Paul's vision, the Messianic era had broken in. The Messianic era had broken in, and Paul saw in the prophetic scriptures, Paul saw in Deuteronomy and the Psalms and other passages in Isaiah that in the Messianic era, or in a future time, that the Gentiles would serve God alongside of Israel. The Gentiles would serve God together with the Jewish people. And he realized, wait, Messiah has come. Messiah has come. And now in Messiah's family, the two become one without losing their distinctives. Now, when a Jewish man wakes up in the morning, what's one of the first prayers he prays? He prays a prayer of thanksgiving. And he thanks God for three things. What? He thanks God that he's not a woman. He thanks God that he's not a Gentile. He thanks God that he's not a slave. Now, looking at that from the outside, that seems extremely arrogant, especially if you are a woman or a Gentile or a slave. A traditional Jew thinks like this. A woman, because of certain things that she will experience on a monthly basis are things that could be related to childbearing, childbirth, child rearing, and things like that in her monthly cycle. There are certain commandments from which she is exempt because she cannot keep them because of certain other physical issues that she may have that could render her unclean and so on. So there are certain time-related commandments that a woman is free from. Therefore, a Jewish woman is not obligated to keep every single commandment that a Jewish man would be obligated to keep. What about a Gentile? Well, of course, a Gentile was never given the entire Torah to keep. So a Gentile would not be required to keep the entire Torah. What about a slave? Well, the slave can't because they're under someone else's control, and that other person may make them work on the Sabbath or only feed them food that's non-kosher or whatever, and they have no control over the matter. They want to go and offer sacrifice, but they can't because they're someone's slave. So who is it, the only one, who is required to keep all of the commandments through Jewish eyes? A free Jewish male. Not a slave, not a Gentile, not a woman. Are you getting it? What does Paul write to the Galatians, to the Colossians? That in Messiah, in Yeshua, there is neither, what? Jew or Gentile, Jew or Greek, circumcised or uncircumcised. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. Now, elsewhere in his letters, he addresses masters and he addresses slaves, so he knows they still exist. Elsewhere in his letters, he addresses men with certain teaching and women with other teaching, so he knows they exist and he makes distinctions. But what he's saying there, and it could well be that this Jewish tradition existed already in his day, of saying, I thank God I'm not a woman, I'm not a slave, I'm not a Gentile. And Paul says in Messiah, there's no male or female, there's no slave or free, there's no Jew or Gentile. What he means is we all stand equally before God. What he means is in Yeshua, there is no caste system, there is no class system. That we all have access to God through Yeshua, that we all can stand in his presence as spiritual priests in a spiritual temple that he has now built and offer up spiritual sacrifices of praise and adoration. And there's no distinction, and we are all called to obey him fully. He's not saying that in God's sight there's no difference between a Jew or a Gentile, a man or a woman, or a slave or a free person in terms of different abilities, different callings, things a woman can do that a man can't, and vice versa, things that he's given to Gentiles, things that he's given to Jews. Our unity is found in our diversity. Our unity is found in our distinctives. Just like you listen to an orchestra, it has all the different instruments, each playing their part. Our diversity, our distinctives bring unity. So today you have a Messianic congregation worshiping on Shabbat, on the seventh-day Sabbath. And they may share a building with a church. And that church meets on Sunday morning and celebrates the resurrection of Jesus. And they're one in Yeshua. And the Jewish believers may say, you know, just to be in solidarity with our people, we don't eat shellfish, we don't eat bacon, pork, and that's just to be in solidarity with our people. We know it doesn't internally defile us. We understand those principles of Yeshua. Those things don't internally defile us. In that sense, foods are clean, but we choose to not eat certain things. But we've got no problem whatsoever with our Gentile friends eating bacon. It doesn't matter to us. In other words, each group can have their distinctives. You can have your men's, women's, you can have men's meetings and your women's meetings in your congregations. That's fine. Men can have certain leadership roles, women other ministry functions. That's fine. But Paul's saying there is no barrier that separates us anymore. Ephesians 2, the middle wall of partition has come down. So in that sense, the commandments that would divide us have come down so that we can have unity in Messiah. And we know in the temple in Jerusalem in Yeshua's day that there was that wall. No woman can go beyond here. No Gentile can go beyond here. In Yeshua, that wall comes down. We have equal access to God. It doesn't mean the law is abolished. It means it now comes into its fullest expression and meaning in the Messianic era. And it also means that it may be on the hearts of Jews to live a certain way and Gentiles to live a certain way, but we do this as one body without ethnic or racial or spiritual separation. And we find unity in our diversity. The last lecture, I want to look at the question of Jewish tradition and why we reject the idea that there's an unbroken chain of tradition going all the way back to Moses on Mount Sinai. Thanks so much for watching the broadcast. One of our viewers recently communicated to me, there's nothing more important that you can be doing. And you know, we hear from Jewish people through our materials, they've come to faith in Jesus Yeshua. Others had fallen away and they've come back to the Lord. Christians tell us they're now equipped to reach Jewish people with the gospel. And we have amazing open doors before us to reach more and more Jewish people than ever before, but we need your help. Everything we do is a team effort. Would you join together with us and become part of our team? Go to my website right now, askdrbrown.org, askdrbrown.org. Click on the support banner, the TV support banner, and join us. And for your gift of any size, I want to send you this book. I'm going to sign it for you. It's an exclusive hardcover edition of my book, The Real Kosher Jesus, which was written and published in a miraculous 10 weeks' time. I'll send it to you for your gift of any size. Go to askdrbrown.org, click on the TV support banner, become a monthly supporter, help us with a one-time gift, and friend, be assured that together we're making a difference in the salvation of Israel.
Please visit our website or call and ask how you can receive access to our countless free resources. Learn exciting information on what is happening around the world and with our ministry today. When you visit our website, be sure to check out our bookstore for the latest videos, books, and more. You may want to join us during an upcoming radio broadcast. Please contact us today for more information. Please remember, this ministry depends on tax-deductible donations from viewers like you.
Well, I trust you enjoyed this week's episode of our broadcast answering your toughest questions. We've just finished now answering Jewish objections to the New Testament, and I hope you found it enlightening and faith-building. Next week, we're going to begin to tackle traditional Jewish objections to faith in Jesus. If you're a committed Christian, these broadcasts will be completely eye-opening to you. They'll bring you into a realm that you probably didn't even know existed. And if you are watching as a Jewish person and you do not yet believe in Jesus, or maybe you're just wondering, how could the rabbis possibly be wrong? Be sure to tune in next week as we begin to answer traditional Jewish objections to faith in Jesus, Yeshua the Messiah. And be sure to visit my website, askdrbrown.org, for hundreds of hours of free resources. Join me next week right here on Answering Your Toughest Questions.
This has been a paid program made possible by financial contributions to Ask Dr. Brown Ministries from viewers like you in your area. Thank you for your support.